When we observe the Maori population today, there is little evidence of the gold-haired, green-eyed people. So what happened to them? To help us answer this question, let's look at what happened in the Central Pacific. The redheads of New Zealand are not alone. There are legends and documented records of early explorers meeting the red-haired people throughout the Pacific. For example, when Captain Wallis on HMS Dolphin visited Tahiti in 1767, they noticed that over 10% of the population were white-skinned with golden hair, especially on the islands of Huahine and Ra'ietea, a name that originally meant the white-skinned people of Ra. When Captain Cook visited Tahiti 2 years later, the golden-haired people had all but disappeared. He was told that they had become sick and died just after the departure of the HMS Dolphin. Could it be that these white-skinned, golden-haired people were more susceptible to European diseases than the Polynesians? This might indicate that their lack of resistance to European disease means they weren't of European origin despite their appearance. To this day, Samoans, through annual festivals, venerate their red-haired ancestors. Some of these were peace-loving, but others, under the reign of Batuku the Longskull, were bloodthirsty cannibals who lived on the bay called the Putrefaction of Men. These cannibals would prey upon the peaceful people of Tonga and Futuna. They particularly fancied the firstborn child. They'd noticed that the second often died, therefore the first must be much stronger. Their belief was that they would take on the strength and qualities of the people they ate. But did they misunderstand what was really happening? It is well known now that the recessive gene is often accompanied by the rhesus-negative blood group, in which second children frequently die. So the red-headed blood group would have been incompatible with the Polynesian chiefs, who were renowned for taking red-haired women for their wives. This would have severely curtailed the number of redheads in the Pacific. Patuku's reign of terror was brought to an end in the 13th century when Polynesian chief Savea rid Samoa of those barbarous fair-skinned savages. Unfortunately, the peace-loving redheads of Easter Island and New Zealand may have been caught up in the aftermath of this war. This seething hatred towards the redheads resurfaced on Easter Island in 1680, when, due to a terrible famine, war broke out and all but 3 of Hotumotua's descendants were driven into a raging fire in the Poiki ditch.
Well, I know the Ngāti Hotu people, they were a peaceful people. They didn't know war and fighting until the Māoris arrived. But between Taupo and Ruapehu, 3,000 Ngāti Hotu were killed by 2 whareto. And there were 600 killed here in Taumaranui by the Maniapoto people. And that was the last cannibal feast of New Zealand. It was held here at the Cherry Grove, and 600 Ngāti Hotu perished. This picture of my grandmother, Te Oti Mihitarina, was one of the 5 survivors of the Taurewa forest in the year of 1860.
This is one of the caves that had all the skeletons of the Turihu and Whiteheart people stacked in. There's skulls and skeletons all around here. In 1861, Robertson's bone mill come up from only hunger and gathered them all up, paid all the workers threepence a sack to grind up as bone dust fertiliser. They estimate at least 60,000 skeletons were recovered from just this one region. And fortunately, they didn't get them all. There's a couple of caves with these fellows in it. The turtle herd, the coffin's about 5 foot long, made out of New Zealand kauri.
Do you have any of these skeletons?
Oh no, no,
Do they have to go somewhere?
No, I've just left them where they are. Well, I'll tell you what happened. Dr. Paul Moon of Auckland University fame was doing a book some years ago, this horrible practice about cannibalism. I didn't know him from a bar of soap. He got hold of me and says, "Oh Noel, can you show me some of these cannibal sites, the remains of these cannibal sites?" So I took him up to one of those, and he was a great excited photograph and what have you, and then he found they weren't Maori bones. He wasn't very much interested. And the next night on New Zealand television, here he was there with his mates, gathering all the bones up, stuffing them in plastic bags. They went down the road somewhere, dug a hole and threw them in there. Well, the Maori don't treat,
That's not how they treat their dead.
No. I was very keen to get DNA and everything done on, who were these people, where'd they come from. And I was at a conference some years ago in Rotorua, and there was a forensic pathologist from England. I was talking to him about them, and he said, "Oh, I've got a few days after the conference, I'll come up." So he spent 3 days with me. I took him around these various sites. There's just one of the many sites. I took him to about 5 different sites. And so he started examining them, and what he was staggered was the tree panning in the skulls. And he says, "Oh, this one lived, this one died." I said, "How do you do that?" And he showed me how to put your finger in it and run your finger around. If there was a ridge, they lived, they survived. If it was just straight, they died. But you imagine laying on the ground and boring a hole in the skull. But this is an old Egyptian, Greek practice, tree panning.
Small people?
Oh yeah, about 4 foot, 4'3". And well, you see the skeletons, he examined them all, measured them, and he took an eye tooth to England. And 18 months later, he says, "Noel, those are ancient Celtic people living in Wales 3,500 years ago. This is where they originated from."
This is not the only genetic information that links the fair-skinned Maori to the Celts. Jean Dosset did a study on the redheads of Easter Island and found that their DNA was very close to the Basque and Welsh populations of ancient Europe.
You go back to the islands, you're not going to see the swirling, the intertwining things, Where does this come from? And it's like, man, I could translate that and make it look exactly like a Celtic pattern. So we had to be influenced by peoples or surroundings that were already here.
We had at least 3 distinct groups of the Patupaiarehe. Some were very, very tall. They seemed to occupy the whole west coast and areas inland. I think their big skulls have been found over it. Whenever these skeletons are found, they're turned over to iwi and destroyed.
Martin went on to tell us about the Raglan Giants, so we're heading there now to see what we can find. When we arrived at Raglan Harbour, we noticed some flat-topped hills that, according to the local Maori, were fashioned by red-haired giants. These people also lived on the coast at the foot of their sacred mountain, Karioi. In a battle with the marauding Tainui, they were driven over the edge at Tototo Gorge, and their bones littered the base of the cliffs. We were told giant skulls could still be found hidden in the crevices and caves along the Raglan shoreline. It is said their heads were the size of pumpkins and their jaws could fit around one's own with over an inch to spare. In our search for skeletons, we heard about a cave burial on the shores of Lake Okatina. We were told there were 2 bound skeletons guarding a canoe surrounded by poisonous tutu berries. In the canoe lay a cloaked red-haired chief wearing a large tiki. After a painstaking scramble through ancient kawa forest, past giant puriri and karaka trees, we finally found it. Only to discover that almost everything had been destroyed except for a small section of a highly decorated burial canoe. We have just had a conversation with an excavator driver. He was doing an excavation up in Northland, and he was clearing the ground, and he saw what he thought looked like some white footballs in the ground. So he cleared a little bit around these white footballs and found them to be skulls. He didn't feel good about this at all, so he called the Auckland Museum, and there he was told by a person that there was absolutely nothing they could do at the museum because the local iwi or tribes had no interest in these skeletons because they were not of their era or of their clan, and that so tied was the curator's hands that he explained to our digger driver friend that there were over 2,000 of these skeletons that had been found hunched in a fetal position and bound, and yet buried north of Russell in a place called Awanui, and they simply had to be excavated over the top of. There was nothing they could do. Our question is, good gracious me, what are these skeletons? Who were they? And why were they being destroyed? I mean, for goodness sake, if you touch a skull today, what is going on that it was all right to just continue excavating over the top of these skeletons? This almost seems, well, A, it's hypocritical, but B, it's almost criminal.
In 1981, the government called in the New Zealand Forest Service and the Land and Survey to survey all the stonework up in the Waipua there, because they were going to clear fell. There had been a lot of pine trees planted on the western side of the Waipua, and so there was a team of 36, and I was the 37th archaeologist. We were up there for over 12 months doing the work up there, and then the initial dating came through, 2225 BC, and the Maori guy that was in charge, next day he closed the whole operation down. There was over $500,000 of taxpayers' money spent on this archaeological thing. All the findings, mapping, all the work we'd done was deposited in the National Archives in Wellington with a hold on for 75 years. And Gary Cook successfully got some of them released a few years ago, but all the carbon datings, they've all disappeared.
Gone.
There's one of the walls that we exposed up in the Waipua there, and the top of that wall was ground level.
It's been closed down now.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You can't go into that forest at all?
Oh, you go and you might never come back out.
So it looks like going into the Waipua forest is out of the question. Luckily, There are other places around the country similar to the Waipua site that can still be seen. The Auckland Airport, Te Papakanga Park, and on a farm in Northland. Here, we were shown around by Vince, a local farmer.
When I first came here, some of these piles were round, straight sides, some were square, straight sides, some were oblong. Nearly all dead straight sides, very loosely constructed, as you can see right through into them. See the small pebble stones inside them?
Yeah.
That's how loosely constructed they are. Watch they don't fall down on you, love.
What they built those fences for, whether they were keeping animals or well, there was no real animals, poultry or something in these confined areas, but we never actually got down.
My particular generation and those before me here in New Zealand were raised with a particular kind of history. And it's in all of our old history books. Maori, Kamatwas, Tohungas were very open about their history, and they shared it with the colonial anthropologists or archaeologists who came through. And you found that the old people, if they thought you were worth talking to, would take you aside and they'd tell you all the old stories. So we just knew what the history of the country was directly from the Maori kuias and elders themselves. Came back to New Zealand in 1974 and noted that there was sort of an enforced amnesia being put over the people of the country, where we just weren't allowed to know that old history anymore. And it seems we were being led to forget all of that for somebody's political agenda or for political expediency. And I knew it to be false, and I watched as our older history books were taken off the shelves of the libraries and replaced by sort of a new wave of Marxist history books.
And mind you, all these books that have been written up of Ngāti Hotu, they all go to the fiction shelf today.
A great many people say we don't exist. The law of this land says we don't exist. The Minister of Treaty Settlements says we don't exist. But we are here, our oral traditions are here, still alive and well, and resting with people who are carrying on that tradition.
But this is what is going on, you know. Our institutions and the brainwashing is going on. They've rewritten New Zealand's history.
From Wellington?
Yeah.
And that's iwi or?
Oh, it's governmental, departmental control. They don't want anything pre-Maori or pre-Tasman to come out.
It was easier to sweep us under the carpet, because today our fight is really against the Crown, not the Waitangi Tribunal itself, or the people. You can't blame the people when they got, you know, when they've got the power behind them.
If we could have a Royal Commission inquiry and get the true, you know, academics in New Zealand and the groundwork people, do a complete, all the evidence is there.
As Noel says, it is imperative that we have a Royal Commission to make public this vital history that at present is being denied. There's no doubt that there were earlier people living here who were either red or golden-haired. Now, what would it take to give the Ngāti Hotu and the Waitaha people back their rightful position and place as the foundation of Maori culture in New Zealand, and stop this fascinating history from being lost forever?
Kia tu ngamana ki tanga e te